So today we get to finish off The Little House in the Big Woods. I'm so excited. This is the final chapter or two, I believe. We're going to wrap it up today, and then tomorrow we'll get to start with a new book. So our chapter that we're starting with is called The Wonderful Machine. The next day, Pa cut heads from several of the oats and brought the clean, bright yellow straws to Ma. She put them in a tub of water to soften them and to keep them soft. Then she sat in the chair by the side of the tub and braided the straws. She took up several of them, knotted their ends together, and began to braid. The straws were different lengths, and when she came to the end of one of the straws, she put a new long one from the tub in its place and went on braiding. She let the end of the braid fall back into the water and kept on braiding until she had many yards of braid. All her spare time for days she was braiding straws. She made a fine, narrow, smooth braid using 7 of the smaller straws. She used 9 larger straws for a wider braid and made it notched all along the edges. And from the very largest straws, she made the widest braid of all. What do you think she's going to be doing or making with all these braids? Of straw. When all the straws were braided, she threaded a needle with strong white thread, and beginning at the end of a braid, she sewed it round and round, holding the braid so it would lie flat after it was sewed. This made a little mat, and Ma said that it was the top of the crown of a hat. Then she held the braid tighter on one edge and kept on sewing it around and around. The braid drew in and made the sides of the crown. When the crown was high enough, Ma held the braid loosely again, and she kept on sewing around and around, and the braid lay flat, and that was the hat brim. When the brim was wide enough, Ma cut the braid and sewed the end fast, so that it could not unbraid itself. Ma sewed hats for Mary and Laura of the finest, narrowest braid. For Pa and herself she made hats of the wider, notched braid. That was Sunday's Pa hat. That was Pa's Sunday hat. Then she made him 2 everyday hats of the coarser, widest braid. When the hats were finished, Ma set them on a board to dry, shaping them nicely as she did so, and when it dried, they'd stayed in the shape that she gave them. Take a look. Here are some of the hats that she made. Ma could make beautiful hats. Laura liked to watch her, and she learned how to braid the straw and made a little hat for Charlotte. The days were growing shorter and the nights were cooler. One night Jack Frost passed by, and in the morning there were bright colors here and there among the green leaves of the big woods. Then all the leaves stopped being green, and they were yellow and scarlet, crimson and golden and brown. Along the rail fence, the sumach held up its dark red cones of berries above bright flame-colored leaves. Acorns were falling from the oaks, and Laura and Mary made little acorn cups and saucers for the playhouses. Walnuts and hickory nuts were dropping to the ground in the big woods, and squirrels were scampering busily everywhere, gathering their winter's store of nuts and hiding them away in hollow trees. Laura and Mary went with Ma to gather walnuts and hickory nuts and hazelnuts. They spread them into the sun to dry, and then they beat off the dried outer hulls and stored the nuts in the attic for winter. It was fun to gather the large round walnuts and the smaller hickory nuts and the little hazelnuts that grew in bunches on the bushes. The soft outer hulls of the walnuts were full of a brown juice that stained their hands, but the hazelnut hull smelled good and tasted good too when Laura used her teeth to pry a nut loose. Everyone was busy now, for all the garden vegetables must be stored away. Laura and Mary helped, picking up the dusty potatoes after Pa had dug them from the ground, and pulling the long yellow carrots and the round purple-topped turnips. And they helped Ma cook the pumpkin for pumpkin pies. With the butcher knife, Ma cut the big orange-colored pumpkins into halves. Then she cleaned the seeds out of the center and cut the pumpkin into long slices, from which she pared the rind. Laura helped her cut the slices into cubes. Ma put the cubes into the big iron pot on the stove, poured in some water, and then watched while the pumpkin slowly boiled down all day long. All the water and the juice must be boiled away, and the pumpkin must never burn. The pumpkin was a thick, dark, good-smelling mass in the kettle. It did not boil like water, but bubbles came up in it and suddenly exploded. leaving holes that closed quickly. Every time a bubble exploded, the rich, hot pumpkin smell came out. Laura stood on a chair and watched the pumpkin for Ma and stirred it with a wooden paddle. She held the paddle in both hands and stirred carefully, because if the pumpkin burned, there wouldn't be any pumpkin pies. For dinner, they ate the stewed pumpkin with their bread. They made it into pretty shapes on their plates. It was a beautiful color and smoothed and molded so prettily with their knives. Ma never allowed them to play with their food at table. They must always eat nicely everything that was set before them, leaving nothing on their plates. But she did let them make the rich brown stewed pumpkin into pretty shapes before they ate it. At other times, they had baked Hubbard squash for dinner. The rind was so hard that Ma had to take Pa's axe to cut the squash into pieces. When the pieces were baked in the oven, Laura loved to spread the soft insides with butter and then scoop the yellow flesh from the rind and eat it. For supper now, they often had hulled corn and milk. And that was good too. It was so good that Laura could hardly wait for the corn to be ready, and after Ma started to hull it. It took 2 or 3 days to make hulled corn. The first day, Ma cleaned and brushed all the ashes out of the cook stove, and then she burned some clean, bright hardwood and saved its ashes. She put the hardwood ashes in a little cloth bag. That night, Pa brought in some ears of corn with large, plump kernels. He nubbed the ears, shelling off all the small, chafy kernels at their tips, and then he shelled the rest into a large pan until the pan was full. Early next day, Ma put the shelled corn and the bag of ashes into a big iron kettle. She filled the kettle with water and kept it boiling a long time. At last, the kernels of corn began to swell, and they swelled until their skins split open and began to peel off. When every skin was loose and peeling, Ma lugged the heavy kettle outdoors. She filled a clean wash tub with cold water from the spring, and she dipped the corn out of the kettle into the tub. Then she rolled the sleeves of her flowered calico dress above her elbows, and she knelt by the tubs. With her hands, she rubbed and scrubbed the corn until the hulls came off and floated on top of the water. Often she poured the water off and filled the tub again with buckets of water from the spring. She kept on rubbing and scrubbing the corn between her hands and changing the water until every hull came off and was washed away. Here's a picture of Ma doing just that. Cleaning off the hulls in the buckets. Ma looked pretty with her bare arms, plump and white, her cheeks so red and her dark hair smooth and shining, while she scrubbed and rubbed the corn in the clear water. She never splashed one drop of water on her pretty dress. When at last the corn was done, Ma put all the soft white kernels in a big jar in the pantry. Then at last they had hulled corn and milk for supper. Sometimes they had hulled corn for breakfast with maple syrup, and sometimes Ma fried the soft kernels in pork drippings, but Laura liked them best with milk. Autumn was great fun. There was so much work to do and so many good things to eat, so many new things to see. Laura was scampering and chattering like the squirrels from morning till night. One frosty morning, a machine came up the road. 4 horses were pulling it, and 2 men were on it. The horses hauled it up into the field where Pa and Uncle Henry and Grandpa and Mr. Peterson had stacked their wheat. 2 more men drove it after it in another, smaller machine. Pa called to Ma that the threshers had come, and he hurried out to the field with his team. Laura and Mary asked Ma, and then they ran out to the field after him. They might watch, if they were careful not to get in the way. Uncle Henry came riding up and tied his horse to a tree. Then he and Pa hitched all the other horses, 8 of them, to the smaller machine. They hitched each team to the end of a long stick that came out from the center of the machine. A long iron rod lay along the ground, and from this machine to the big machine. Afterward, Laura and Mary asked questions, and Pa told them that the big machine was called the separator, and the rod was called the tumbling rod, and the little machine was called the horsepower. 8 horses were hitched to it and made it go, so this was an 8-horsepower machine. Wow, take a look. So here we have the horsepower machine. We've got 4 pairs of horses, so 8 horses going around it hitched to these rods coming out. And they spin as they walk around, right? They spin this rod that's along the ground that's connected over here. And that allows this to spin and work. This was one of the first machines using horsepower, right? Now we have tractors that are, 100 horsepower that do the same work as 100 horses. Very different, right? A man sat on top of the horsepower, and when everything was ready, he clucked to the horses and they began to go. They walked around him in a circle, each team pulling on the long stick to which it was hitched, and following the team ahead. As they went around, they stepped carefully over the tumbling rod, which was tumbling over and over on the ground. Their pulling made the tumbling rod keep rolling over, and the rod moved the machinery of the separator, which stood beside the stack of wheat. All this machinery made an enormous racket, rackety banging and clanging. Laura and Mary held tight to each other's hands at the edge of the field and watched with all their eyes. They had never seen a machine before. They had never heard such a racket. Pa and Uncle Henry, on top of the wheat stack, were pitching bundles down onto a board. A man stood at the board and cut the bands on the bundles and crowded the bundles one at a time into a hole at the end of the separator. The hole looked like the separator's mouth, and it had long iron teeth. The teeth were chewing. They chewed the bundles, and the separator swallowed them. Straw blew out at the separator's other end, and wheat poured out of its side. Two men were working fast, trampling the straw and building it into a stack. One man was working fast, sacking the pouring grain, and the grains of wheat poured out of the separator into a half-bushel measure. And as fast as the measure filled, the man slipped an empty one in its place and emptied the full one into a sack. Then he had just enough time to empty it and slip it back under the spout before the other measure ran over. All the men were working as fast as they possibly could, but the machine kept right up with them. Laura and Mary were so excited they could hardly breathe. They held hands tightly and stared. The horses walked around and around. The man who was driving them cracked his whip and shouted, "Get up there, John. No use trying to shirk." Crack went the whip. "Careful there, Billy. Easy, boy. You can't go but so fast nohow. You can't go but so fast nohow." The separator swallowed the bundles. The golden straw blew out of in a golden cloud. The wheat streamed golden brown out of the spout. While the men hurried, Pa and Uncle Henry pitched bundles down as fast as they could. The chaff and dust blew over everything. Laura and Mary watched as long as they could. Then they ran back to the house to help Ma get dinner for all those men. A big kettle of cabbage and meat was boiling on the stove. A big pan of beans and a Johnny cake were baking in the oven. Laura and Mary set the table for the threshers. They put out salt rising bread and butter, bowls of stewed pumpkin pies and dried berry pies, and cookies, cheese and honey, and pitchers of milk. Then Ma put on the boiled potatoes and cabbage and meat, the baked beans, the hot Johnny cake, and the baked Hubbard squash, and she poured the tea. Laura always wondered why bread made of cornmeal was called Johnny cake. It wasn't cake. Ma didn't know unless the Northern soldiers called it Johnny cake, because the people in the South where they fought ate so much of it. They called the Southerners soldiers Johnny Rebs. Maybe they called the Southern bread cake, just for fun. Ma had heard some say that it should be called journey cake. She didn't know. It wouldn't be very good bread to take on a journey. At noon, the threshers came in to the table loaded with food. But there was none too much, for threshers work hard and get very hungry. By the middle of the afternoon, the machines had finished all the threshing, and the men who owned them drove them away into the big woods, taking with them the sacks of wheat that were their pay. They were going to the next place where neighbors had stacked their wheat and wanted the machines to thresh it also. Pa was very tired that night, but he was also happy. He said to Ma, "It would have taken Henry and Peterson and Pa and me a couple of weeks apiece to thresh as much grain with flails as that machine threshed today. We wouldn't have got as much wheat either, and it wouldn't have been as clean." "That machine's a great invention," he said. "Other folks can stick to old-fashioned ways if they want to, but I'm all for progress. It's a great age we're living in. As soon as I raise wheat, I'm going to have a machine come and thresh it, if there's one anywhere in the neighborhood." But he was too tired that night to talk to Laura. But Laura was proud of him. It was Pa who had got the other men to stack their wheat together and send for the threshing machine. It was a wonderful machine. Everybody was glad that it had come. Here's the last chapter, called "The Deer in the Wood." The grass was dry and withered, and the cows must be taken out of the woods and kept in the barn to be fed. All the bright-colored leaves became dull brown when the cold fall rains began. There was no more playing under the trees, but Pa was in the house when it rained, and he again began to play the fiddle after dinner. Then the rain stopped. The weather grew colder. In the early mornings, everything sparkled with frost. The days were growing short, and a little fire burned all day in the cook stove to keep the house warm. Winter was not far away. The attic and the cellar were full of good things once more, and Laura and Mary had started to make patchwork quilts. Everything was beginning to be snug and cozy again. One night, when he came in from doing the chores, Pa said that after supper he would go to his deer lick and watch for a deer. There had been no fresh meat in the little house since spring, but now the fawns were grown up, and Pa would go hunting again. Pa had made a deer lick in an open place in the woods, with trees nearby in which he could sit to watch it. A deer lick was a place where the deer came to get salt. When they found a salty place in the ground, they came there to lick it, and that was called a deer lick. Pa had made one by sprinkling salt all over the ground. After supper, Pa took his gun and went into the woods, and Laura and Mary went to sleep without any stories or music. As soon as they woke in the morning, they ran to the window, but there was no deer hanging in the trees. Pa had never before gone out to get a deer and came home without one. Laura and Mary did not know what to think. All day, Pa was busy banking the little house and the barn with dead leaves and straw, held down by stones to keep out the cold. Here's a picture of him doing that. Putting the straw and rock stones on top of them to keep the drafts from being cold inside. The weather grew colder all day, and that night there was once more a fire on the hearth, and the windows were shut tight and chinked for the winter. After supper, Pa took Laura on his knee, while Mary sat close in her little chair, and Pa said, "Now I'll tell you why you had no fresh meat to eat today. When I went out to the deer lick, I climbed up into a big oak tree. I found a place on a branch where I was comfortable and could watch the deer lick. I was near enough to shoot any animal that came to it, and my gun was loaded and ready on my knee. There I sat and waited for the moon to rise and light the clearing. I was a little tired from chopping wood all day yesterday, and I must have fallen asleep, for I found myself opening my eyes. The big round moon was just rising. I could see it between the bare branches of the trees, low in the sky. And right against it I saw a deer standing. His head was up, and he was listening. His great branching horns stood out above his head. He was dark against the moon. It was a perfect shot, but he was so beautiful, he looked so strong and free and wild, that I couldn't kill him. I sat there and looked at him until he bounded away into the dark woods. Then I remembered that Ma and my little girls were waiting for me to bring home some good fresh venison. I made up my mind that next time I would shoot. After a while, a big bear came lumbering out into the open. He was so fat from feasting on berries and roots and grubs all summer that he was nearly as large as 2 bears. His head swayed from side to side as he went on all fours across the clear space in the moonlight, until he came to a rotten log. He smelled it and listened. Then he pawed it apart and sniffed among the broken pieces, eating up the fat white grubs. Then he stood up on his hind legs, perfectly still, looking all around him. He seemed to be suspicious that something was wrong. He was trying to see or smell what it was. He was a perfect mark to shoot at, but I was so much interested in watching him, and the woods were so peaceful in the moonlight, that I forgot all about my gun. I did not even think of shooting him until he was waddling away into the woods. This will never do, I thought. I'll never get any meat this way. I settled myself in the tree and waited again. This time I was determined to shoot the next game I saw. The moon had risen higher, and the moonlight was bright in the little open place. All around it in the shadows were dark among the trees. After a long while, a doe and her yearling fawn came stepping daintily out of the shadows. They were not afraid at all. They walked over to the place where I had sprinkled the salt, and they both licked up a little bit of it. Then they raised their heads and looked at each other. The fawn stepped over and stood beside the doe. They stood there together, looking at the woods and the moonlight. Their large eyes were shining and soft. I just sat there looking at them until they walked away among the shadows. Then I climbed down out of the tree and came home. Laura whispered in his ear, "I'm glad you didn't shoot them." Mary said. "We can eat bread and butter." Pa lifted Mary out of her chair and hugged them both together. "You are my good girls," he said, "and now it's bedtime. Run along while I get my fiddle." When Laura and Mary had said their prayers and were tucked snugly under the trundle bed's covers, Pa was sitting in the firelight with the fiddle. Ma had blown out the lamp because she did not need its light. On the other side of the hearth, she was swaying gently in her rocking chair, and her knitting needles flashed in and out above the sock that she was knitting. The long winter evenings of firelight and music had come again. Pa's fiddle wailed while Pa was singing, "Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I'm going to California, the gold dust for to see." Then Pa began to play again the song about old Grimes, but he did not sing the words he had sung when Ma was making cheese. These words were different. Pa's strong, sweet voice was singing softly. "Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and the days of auld lang syne? The days of auld lang syne, my friend, and the days of auld lang syne. Should old acquaintance be forgot and the days of auld lang syne." When the fiddle had stopped singing, Laura called out softly, "What are days of auld lang syne, Pa?" "They are the days of a long time ago, Laura," he said. "Go to sleep now." But Laura lay awake a little while, listening to Pa's fiddle softly playing and to the lonely sound of the wind in the big woods. She looked at Pa sitting on the bench by the hearth, the firelight gleaming on his brown hair and beard and glistening on the honey-brown fiddle. She looked at Ma, gently rocking and knitting. She thought to herself, "This is now." She was glad that the cozy house and Pa and Ma and the firelight and the music were now. They could not be forgotten, she thought, because now is now. It can never be a long time ago. The end. Thanks you all for joining me as we were reading this book by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and we shall see you tomorrow again at 5 o'clock for our next chapter book story time. Bye.